So thank you everybody for inviting me to have a little chat with you. When I started my regenerative journey back in 2008 or thereabouts, well, I guess we kind of started really much earlier than that, because when I was about 15, I decided that, well, to me, it didn't make sense to grow food with poisons. So I started reading a lot about organic gardening at the time, information put out by the Rodale Institute in the US, which has been doing, side-by-side research around organic compared to conventional. It's been ongoing for at least 40 years now. And eventually they started putting out a publication called The New Farm. And it was a lovely magazine. They showcased, farmers in the States shifting back to our roots and getting animals back on pasture, just like you do in New Zealand. And in my regenerative journey, I've learned quite a bit about the big picture. And I want to share that with you because it puts the New Zealand farmers, I think, in a very good light. I think some well-meaning farmers in New Zealand have offered to reduce their methane to heal the climate. But I do think you're barking up the wrong tree. And I think, the farmers that are getting kicked to the curb right now are the ones that really are probably getting the best environmental outcomes, the grass-based farmers like yourselves. So I'm going to go into a little bit of the science around that because, as part of my regenerative journey, I kind of discovered that regenerating our earth and even the health of the climate is all related to building back life. It's all about life. It's not about less cows or having less animals. We really need more because we've really reduced those levels. So if you don't mind, I'll just put that into perspective kind of quickly and introduce myself as well. So I'm going to go share my screen. And I'll hop on to some slides. And a lot of these are in the New Zealand context, so that it's going to be applicable to you. And we are away. So I was farming in New York State and Vermont for 25 years before I moved to New Zealand 5 years ago. New York is one of the bigger dairy states. Our dairy industry is probably as big as close to the size of the dairy industry on the South Island. But along my journey, I kind of found out that, well, I started asking questions first about what did these grassland ecosystems used to be like and how productive were they? And for me now, my regenerative journey is really all about regenerating what I call the unlimited grasslands of the past, which I believe were highly more productive. And there's a lot of research out there that supports that. And some of it's just direct evidence from our ancestors. So there's a lot of cave art where, between 20 and 30,000 years ago, our ancestors depicted grasslands that were teeming with animals. They were probably grassland savannas with lovely mosaic type of landscapes. But at a glance, they could see hundreds, if not thousands of, wild game. And, as I was regenerating my farm, I'd ask myself all sorts of questions, like, for instance, why would God put hard hooves on, sheep and cattle when in the ice, they slip and fall on their bums? And the answer to that is, these animals evolved in a symbiotic relationship with the grasslands, and they needed those hard hooves to trample that grass close to the soil. So a lot of my questions that had always kind of bugged me got answered as I thought about how the livestock we're managing fit into the natural ecosystems of the past. And the other thing I've thought of just recently, how could humans have helped animals go extinct? So half of all species that weigh over 100 kgs were wiped out during the megafaunal extinction around, between 13,000 and 15,000 years ago. And there's kind of debate in science whether humans caused it, but because the correlation of humans arriving to new continents coincides with the megafaunal extinctions, I believe we're pretty responsible. And if you think of how our animals behave, it kind of makes sense that it could have easily been achieved. For instance, when we go out to a paddock and we've got a group of heifers or steers, you can walk up quite close to them and they'll just kind of look at you in curiosity until you get close enough where they think you could grab them, and then they might run away from you if they don't know you. And I think that's what happened on the grasslands of the past with these, especially with these herds of, grassland species that had not evolved with people. So they let us get pretty close, and then we'd use our technology like atalatas, which are spear throwers, and the bow and arrow. We could pick them off, and they didn't run away from us. And the other thing is, those of us who have trained dogs, farm dogs, how easy it is to train, a well-bred heading dog, because it's their instinct. And I believe, we evolved for 30,000 years associated with dogs in a symbiotic relationship. And I think how that heading dog instinct was first created is those dogs helped bring, game closer to us so we could pick them off with our technology, and then we would share the spoils with the dogs. So getting back to this megafaunal extinction, and I think it is reasonable to say we're pretty responsible. Many species died out at that time, your woolly mammoths, steppe bison, and the like. And they were associated with all different plants as well. So when we reduced the fauna on the grasslands, the flora was also reduced in diversity and abundance. In fact, there was a study done in 2018, and they felt that if all that life that used to exist, without the impact from human was still on the planet, it would mean there would be around 500 pentagrams of carbon in the biosphere instead of up in the atmosphere where it's gone since. So, there's a carbon cycle, and carbon will flux from the atmosphere to the biosphere, and the biosphere includes, our oceans, our soil life, and the plant life. And carbon's a good thing. It's a source of energy. It's how energy is moved back and forth. And I believe in the past, by reducing the grassland ecosystems, we released a lot of the carbon that was locked up in the sheer biology into the atmosphere. And there's a scientist who studied the desertification of the Sahara. And he noticed that there was a pattern every time people came to a new area. And first, the landscape provided everything we needed. We could just hunt and gather, and things were easy. And then we sat around the campfire and, sang songs or whatever. But then once we diminished those grassland and savannas and kind of hunted too many animals away, we had to start cultivating the land for our needs. And the pattern since then has been the primary production of the whole ecosystem. And primary production is how much energy is, captured by the sun through green and growing plants. So that primary production of the whole ecosystem went down to make room for farming. So farming went up, net primary production went down. And a lot of that, I think diversity is the driver of primary production. So you can see in this photo, we've got, the wheat on the right-hand side. Modern agriculture is a monoculture, and it's replacing, this is American prairie, where there were at least 500 species of different plants, and who knows how many billions of different species under the soil, and not to speak of the animals above. So, so needless to say that the original savanna was way, way more productive than anything we have now. And we just artificially get, satisfactory yields by adding fertilizer. So one thing David Wright noticed in his studies of the desertification of the Sahara, which used to be green with big lakes and rivers, he said that if this trade-off between, the natural ecosystem and farm production continues, eventually it can result in desertification, or at least, degradation of the landscape. And that doesn't happen just in semi-arid environments. It can happen in temperate environments as well. And this is, this picture on the right was taken down here in South Otago. And, it's hard for a New Zealander to consider that part of New Zealand could be desertifying, but you could at least agree we've got soil erosion if we're losing 190 million tons of topsoil per year. But I don't think the animals are to blame. I think the problem is how we are managing them. And I don't think we need fewer ruminants. I think we do have to change how we manage them. But I think mostly we need to change how animals are managed in the Northern Hemisphere, where they've taken animals off the grassland. And I don't know if any of you have looked at Walter Yenna's YouTubes. There's many online that you could look up where he explains how a natural grassland will mitigate 100 times the methane produced by your sheep and cattle. So again, your livestock are not the problem. And I do think with the methane emission thing, unfortunately, New Zealand is barking up the wrong tree. And we'll talk about later things that they could positively measure. But the last thing we want to do is let the Northern Hemisphere tell us how to farm. When I was in California, I was shocked at some of the farming practices where they'll fumigate the soil and brag about killing all life down to several meters deep, which to me is a shock, so that they can grow one species of something. And this is part of Spain seen from space. The whole landscape is covered in plastic. And so how can this make sense? How could it make sense to go to plant-based foods produced this way instead of having cows and sheep on a grassland setting where they are in the water cycle and they're in the carbon cycle in a natural way? It just defies common sense whatsoever. But getting back to David Wright's research, so there was this pattern. As humans solved the problem of growing food to feed ourselves, we reduced the ecosystem around us. But you can reverse it. And Alan Savory was the first human in 60,000 years to come up with a solution of how to buck that trend. So he developed holistic management, which is what got me started on my regenerative journey back in 2008. And on his farm in Zimbabwe, he quadrupled his stocking rate. So he was able to grow more grass and feed. He's got, cattle, sheep, goats, all sorts of things in one big mob. But also the production of the whole ecosystem increased because animals from the wildlife park next door come onto his property because there's more water and there's more food. So he's lifting, it's a rising tide is lifting all boats. He can get more productivity from his farm operation and see diversity increase around him. And so to me, that's kind of where we should be going with this. And we got really good outcomes on our farm. And by the way, John King, who most of you probably know, has been teaching holistic management for 20 years in New Zealand. He's the go-to guy. But we started using a grazing plan. This is a piece of it. There's lots of numbers in it. But the numbers aren't what's important. Well, they are important because it's important to have data. In fact, the last number you'll calculate on the plan is your total production per input or per millimeter of rainfall. And for me, if we're building topsoil, we should be growing more grass and seeing more productivity year on year per millimeter of rainfall. It kind of takes the excuse of weather out of the equation, which is quite ingenious. But if it's going the other way and your productivity is going down, you're probably not, building topsoil and increasing diversity and all those good things. So I think this is a pretty good measure. And there's other monitoring things I'm going to talk about later. But this is the primary one. We don't want to have less animals. We want to have more animals. So on our farm, one of our quality of life goals on our farm in New York, when we started in 2008 with the regenerative, was, we didn't want to milk more cows, but we did grow more grass. So we were able to reduce our purchased grain by $80,000 a year on 100 cows. So we were very happy with that. So our production stayed the same, but our net income went up. But we also had much better health. Our animals were much healthier. We didn't need drench in the last 6 years we farmed because the young stock were managed the same as the cows. We didn't ask them to take the pastures down below 15 centimeters where most of the worm larvae will be lurking. And yeah, we saw more diversity in the pastures, which meant the paddocks didn't dry out when it got hot and dry in the summer. So for the 15 years before we started holistic management, we were, following best practice as has come out of New Zealand and Europe around ryegrass, perennial ryegrass. So we would only plant perennial ryegrass and white clover, but unfortunately, in our continental climate, it got hot and dry in the summer, and that stuff all went dormant. And so this is kind of gives us an opportunity to grow more grass. But one of the really cool outcomes was we saw many, many more birds on the farm, especially ground nesting birds. And this is important for New Zealanders. I always point this out to you because, I'm not a believer in poisons, but I think by providing food for wildlife and habitat, we can increase their numbers, because we saw ground nesting birds, really populations explode. Birds like the bobolink, which I had never even noticed on our farm before. And next thing you know, the air was filled with their song. But we have skunks and snakes, weasels, possums, all sorts of animals, coyotes, all sorts of things that love to eat free eggs. But we still had this huge explosion of ground nesting birds. So there's a lot more to it than just eliminating the pests. And as I pointed out earlier, I think diversity is really important. We just developed more of a tolerance for what we used to call weeds. And, they became reservoirs for our pollinators. And we also tried to add diversity into our farming system with things like pigs and chooks and ducks and other things that we could market. So how I approached the grazing part of my holistic journey, and again, this is following 15 years of perennial ryegrass management. In 2009, we decided to lift the grazing height and the residual height about 5 centimeters a year, which doesn't sound like much, but, and I'm not saying it's the only way to do it, but for us, it allowed us to maintain the quality, because especially in the springtime, if you lose quality in the springtime, it's really gone for the whole summer. And for me, it's really important to be managing for a green leaf, because it's those green vegetative leaves that are pumping liquid carbon down. So although brown might happen, we don't manage for it. It'll happen by accident. Our first year, we started targeting the 3.5 leaf stage of perennial ryegrass, because before that, we thought we were achieving 3 leaves, which we may or may not have been. And we found out that, the 3-leaf stage of perennial ryegrass is the same as the 4-leaf stage of cocksfoot. So then subsequent years, we started seeing more cocksfoot and timothy and red clover. So we started monitoring the cocksfoot as the plant to look at to decide on our recovery. So we lifted from the 4-leaf stage to the between 5 and 7 leaves of cocksfoot later on we found was optimal for our recovery. And earlier when I was, managing, as the New Zealanders had taught us, we had a lot of trouble achieving that 3-leaf stage in the summer. In fact, I'm sure we never did achieve it. It wasn't until I started using this holistic grazing plan that we were able to actually achieve it, because you really have to plan 2 months ahead of time to make it happen. And so this is an example of one of my clients' plans. They're a sheep and beef farmer. And along the bottom, under each arrow is starting with November, the optimal recovery they think they need on their farm for their class of livestock. And of course, it's going to depend if you've got sheep or cattle, or what class of livestock, and also what kind of grasses you're starting with. But this becomes the foundation of the whole grazing plan, which I'll talk a little more about. And this, so to me, this is a good example of the holistic plan grazing done in New Zealand. This is in a dairy context. So he's planted quite a bit of diversity, and this is what he thinks is optimal recovery, and so do I, because the plants have not yet gone to seed. Because remember, only a green leaf can pump liquid carbon down into your soil and build up your soils. And it's by building that soil that we're going to get more productivity year on year. Here's a close-up of, I think, Hamish's pasture. There's the odd seed head, but most plants are still vegetative and green. And there'll still be perennial ryegrass in there, because that's going to be performing in the cool season. And I love this photo. This was taken at Malcolm and Twix White's farm north of Napier. And they've been doing holistic plan grazing. They started with John King in 2011. And I have never seen, such diversity in a pasture in my life anywhere in the world. And you do have an amazing climate for growing grass, and you can grow probably any grass that people can grow anywhere. So lots of diversity, lots of really large leaves. This is a very efficient solar energy harvesting machine. So here's diversity on our farm in New York. This is a deferred pasture. We like to get into our deferred grass kind of on a rotating basis, so none of them started turning brown. So if we had shut something up, but then a month later we still had a surplus, we'd get that grazed, and then we'd shut something else up for deferred, just to keep everything green and growing. And here's an example. It's a runoff at John Camp's. I'm sure some of you know him. And again, the pasture optimally recovered on the right-hand side. And the cows are getting in there and they're grazing it before that seed head comes up. And Hamish Galloway's. So this is in the summer. Come November, it gets pretty hard not to have some seed heads, and we don't worry about it. We'll just focus on growing as much grass in the bottom as we can. And by managing the density, we hope to trample any seed heads or any high lignin material, because the soil needs to be fed too. So there's an expression in holistic management that it's best if you manage for what you want. So there was research done in New Zealand here down in Gore, and they just grew monocultures of different pastures you see on the left. And I was really surprised how well both Timothy and Cocksfoot performed in the summer. So of course the animals on this trial gained more weight on the Timothy and the Cocksfoot than they did on the perennial ryegrass, even though I was always told, and I actually kind of believed, that perennial ryegrass, it was the highest energy grass. So this gives us a clue as to what kind of grasses are going to be good to either encourage to grow or to plant on your farms. And what I mean by managing for what you want, I see a lot of farms all over the world, not just in New Zealand, where to get high quality, especially in the spring with young stock or lambs or something, people will graze at a very immature stage. And that's a pretty good way to manage, sod forming weedy grasses like brown top and dog's tail, because you get in there when it's still, pretty high quality feed, and you can grow your lambs. But you're managing for brown top and dog's tail and ryegrass, which all like the same management. So, using this holistic plan grazing and the principles, we can think about, well, is there some management we can apply to encourage, more drought tolerant plants to grow, which is going to be really important for the Wairarapa, because it's highly likely that we could get into dry spells, and the more diversity you have in the pasture, the more food you're going to have in dry times of the year. And we all know that red clover's got that deep taproot. Timothy and cocksfoot also perform well in the summer. So this is just an example of one of my clients' plans. And it's not a calendar. She actually plans ahead. So she'll plan out where her animals have to be to get back to the same paddock again in the recovery that she wants to achieve, to get the plants to grow that she wants. And that's kind of the basis of it. In this case, she's running cattle in this mob, and she's shooting for the 4-leaf stage of cocksfoot in some new diverse grass that she's planted. This is what a 3.5-leaf stage tiller looks like. And it's really important to remember to just count the pointy leaves. So if a leaf has been bitten off last time, it would have a square tip, whereas if it's a new leaf, it'll be pointy. And I was talking earlier to James about, winter management. And I think this research will be useful for you because, you can see in the summer, that's going to be the important time to avoid overgrazing. And in this case, overgrazing was grazing hard down to 2 centimeters. And when they did that on this trial, they reduced the annual pasture production on that farm by 50%. But notice what happens in the winter. You can take it down to 2 centimeters and you'll actually increase production. And we all know why, because your grass is going to come up fresh and green with no ineffective area in the spring. And I'm all on board with that. But this, I think this summer, time overgrazing, this is our big opportunity to not only introduce new species naturally, but also to grow more grass and grow your grass faster. So this is a kind of a look at what my pastures in New York look like after, after 5 or 6 years of the holistic plan grazing. And we were achieving Timothy and red clover and getting them to persist. And when I was grazing for perennial ryegrass, I thought I was managing for perennial ryegrass. My red clover never persisted because, we'd eat it out with residuals that were too low. But also notice the pasture is green all the way down to the bottom. And I think that's really important to have an effective solar panel and pump that liquid carbon down into the ground. So I was talking earlier about, my strategy to start lifting my covers was a slow one. And I just want to show you some photos, examples of farmers using that approach here in New Zealand. So this is an early November photo taken, I think, down here in South Otago. And, this is a cattle farm. So the grazing height and the residual, I think, should look pretty typical. And one thing Ian Mitchell Innes taught when he was here, that in his experience, it works best to lift your grazing height and residual height over the season gradually, as well as year on year. In other words, you start with what you've always been doing and lift it up smoothly, and you don't jack up quickly. And so here's an example of a sheep and beef farm. And so this might be first or second round, but they've actually grown enough tucker that they have something to trample. and notice that the animals are at a high enough density where they're going to trample enough of the forage that isn't eaten so that the grass can grow up fresh and green through it. And that's the best strategy to keep things nice and green and pumping that liquid carbon. And this might be, you know, a height that might be useful a little later on, once the grasses are starting to get used to it. And once you're past that October, November period when everything wants to go to seed, you can lift that residual that you see on the right-hand side for summertime to keep your soil cool and protect it from the drying winds. And this is a really good residual on the right because almost all the plants have had a bite taken out of them. And of course, if they were kept in there longer, they could take a second and third bite. But with cattle, you'll get the best results if you just let them take one bite, have them at a high density to trample what they didn't eat and shift them on. And then they actually get better quality feed and they grow faster or make more milk. So I just want to jump back to the idea of this pasture recovery plan, as my partner calls it. And I haven't reinvented the wheel. We are using all the principles from holistic management, and we give all the credit to Alan Savory for developing that. But we have adapted it to New Zealand conditions. But when Ian Michelinis was here, he recommended the optimal recovery for cattle would be at the boot stage. And that's the stage in the springtime when the grass has grown as tall as it's going to get before it puts up that seed head. So you could kind of break open the stem and you'll see a little feathery seed head down in the stem. And that's an ingenious way to identify optimal recovery in the springtime. But in New Zealand, grass grows year round, and in the autumn, you know, things aren't pushing up seed heads. So that's why we're using the leaf stage in general. So here's an example of a sheep and beef farm. And notice that, so on the plan, they've colored in the boxes where their animals are going to go or where they've been, depending on where we're at. And notice that, you know, in October, November, it's a pretty short time interval for rest in between, because actually this mob has ewes and lambs in it. We're targeting the 2-leaf stage, not the 3-leaf stage, because that's optimal for that class of stock. So yeah, you're looking, you know, 15 to 18 days recovery possibly in November. And then for February, they're planning on up to 45 days. So I think it's important in New Zealand to figure out your optimal recovery on a monthly basis. And how this helps you grow grass faster is it helps you achieve the fastest part of the grass growth curve more of the time. So this arrow is kind of pointing to roughly where I think the optimal recovery would be on a plant. So it's just before the vegetative growth slows down and the plant starts making seed, or the growth just slows down because it's the plant's getting old, as would happen in the autumn. And I took the data that created that grass growth curve from Andre Voisin's book, and I converted it into kgs of dry matter, just to show the blaze of growth that Andre Voisin talks about it. And Andre Voisin was basically the guy who invented rotational grazing back in the 50s and 60s. So in that experiment, in the first 10 days of recovery, they grew about 100 kgs of dry matter per hectare. And in the second 10 days of recovery, so the same 10-day amount of time, but you know, the 10 days following, they grew 4 times as much, because you know, the plant had pulled from its roots reserved to grow a new leaf, and now they had a leaf there that would collect the sun's energy and help it grow more leaves quicker. So the plant starts growing faster. But notice what happens between day 20 and day 30. They're growing 10 times as much grass. So the grass is growing 10 times faster than it did in the first 10 days of the recovery. So I call that top bar the blaze of growth. And I put it on this graph just to show you the power of that in a real life situation. So this is hypothetical, but theoretically, if a farmer was on a 10-day round using Voisin's data, he or she would get more grazings, but they would grow less total feed because the grass is growing slower. Whereas if they were on a 30-day round, they would get fewer grazing events, but they would grow a heck of a lot more grass. They would grow almost 5 times more grass. And we kind of did an experiment right on our farm, and you can too. At Ridge Park, my partner just used the plate meter, and he found his grass between day 0 and day 18 of recovery grew at 80 kgs a day in the springtime. But between day 18 and day 23, it grew at 120 kgs a day. So this is how using the grazing plan to achieve your optimal recovery can grow your grass faster on your farm than the district average. And again, the optimal recovery is, right where that green arrow is at the top of the grass growth curve, where the plant has experienced all that fast growth, but before it starts losing quality. And so on this graph, notice that that line, the sigmoid grass growth curve, flat lines at the top. Once the grasses approach full recovery, they're not growing anymore. In fact, they stop putting on kgs of dry matter, and the quality just goes south. And this is what happened on my farm early on in my regenerative journey. And I show this on every slide presentation I do here in New Zealand, but I still see well-meaning regenerative farmers letting their pasture over recover. We all made that mistake. Don't do that. So this is my farm in 2011. Ian Mitchell Innes is there in the blue shirt telling me what I've done wrong, and he's 100% correct. We applied a 29-day recovery in our springtime, and it was way too long. We lost the plot, we lost quality, and we were losing animal performance. And one way you can see if you're applying too much recovery and letting plants over recover is you'll have bare spaces in between your clump forming grasses. So these are cocksfoot plants, but notice in between, there's lots of things growing. This is one of my clients. Often I'll go to farms where they've let their pastures over recover in the summer, and that'll be bare soil in between the bunch forming grasses because light hasn't gotten down for so long. So for me, it's really important to keep the green leaves pumping liquid carbon. And I believe this is how we lifted our soil organic matter from 6% to 9% in 6 years on our farm, because they found that the liquid carbon pathway is the best way to get long-term soil carbon into the soil. So it's more important than putting down brown litter. That's why I feel it's important to keep your leaves green. And if you're going to trample leaves, trample green leaves, because then your carbon to nitrogen ratio is going to be the right ratio for a good compost, and it becomes good food for your soil. So again, the liquid carbon pathway is 5 times more powerful at lifting your organic carbon than laying down litter. And so the more we, went down our holistic journey, the more we noticed that our plants were happier and they didn't bolt to seed so quickly. We could grow, pasture that was so thick, it was hard to walk through. Like when we rolled out our electric fence, you'd trip, the grass was so thick. And again, optimal recovery is going to be different for every farm, depending on where you're coming from, what class of stock you have, and what plants you want to see, what you want to achieve, and how fast you want to get there. But again, this recovery time in line 27 on the grazing plan is the foundation of the whole plan. And there's lots of other numbers that we keep track of to help us monitor the plan. And we use all that to put us on a cruise control for our round speed for each month that we think is going to get us to the optimal recovery. And the cool thing about that is it gives you something to monitor against, to know when you have a true surplus. Should I start taking area out because my livestock can't keep up with the grass and eat the residual tidy enough. So maybe I need to take area out now and do some deferred grazing, or make some silage, or get some more livestock on. So it helps you make those decisions proactively before it's too late. And this was the difference for me. This is what really helped me achieve then the optimal recovery in the summer. This farm, it's just a farm that I go past pretty often, and they haven't topped this, but I was really impressed by the kind of quality that they keep on the farm. So they graze it, at different intervals, but almost always at 3-leaf stage in the summer. But by having a lot of animals in there for a short amount of time and then moving them on, they see quite nice quality. And when I was at Guy Frazier's 2 weeks ago up in Tomarunui, he told me a story about this valley. And it's a good example of managing for what you want, because when they bought the farm 5 years ago, this valley was just full of all kinds of thistle. And Kushla, his wife, told me the story that she tried to muster some lambs out of there. And, she was so mad because she had finished up and shut the gate. And then she looks back into the paddock and sees all these little eyes peeking from behind the thistles, all the sheep they had missed. So what Guy did is in the summer, he applied some longer recovery times to allow this grass to outcompete the thistles. So it's a good example of managing for what you want, because if you focus on the weeds and let's say put cattle in there to, deck your weeds or whatever, the cattle are going to lick out the best stuff and really eliminate plants like high quality plants like Timothy before they even touch the weeds. So it kind of works against you. So here's some clients down here in South Otago. You need to get on your knees. And my partner says the act of getting on your knees to look at your plant recovery, it's an act of humility, but it's really one of the observations that's really so important. And this is their farm. They also shoot for the 2-leaf stage as their optimal recovery, just in that pre-Christmas time. And then, ideally you would want to achieve the 3-leaf recovery of perennial ryegrass after Christmas, so that you can start seeing succession of things like cocksfoot and red clovers and, drought tolerant plants that you want to see. And again, the same farm, all the cattle get mobbed together to enhance that trampling effect, because this is what's going to create your quality. This is a trick that my partner uses to decide how many days does it take for each month to, hit that 3-leaf stage or whatever the stage it is you're trying to achieve. And so he'll protect an area. You could protect an area with electric fence or something else if you've got cattle, because of course cattle would love to play with this and kick it all over the paddock. And so, with Rick, we've developed a spreadsheet that makes it easier to do the calculations for figuring out how long your animals need to be in each paddock to get them back to that paddock in that optimal recovery time you've decided on. And I just want to talk a little bit about the monitoring, which is so important with this. The holistic plan grazing is not a grazing system, and that's the reason it'll always work. So let's say you go to a 30-day round all summer. So that would be a system which will work, 1/30 of the time. But how this plan works is you've got a range, and then you kind of look at the weather and decide, well, is the grass growing really fast for the month, or is it growing really slow for the month? For instance, if you're in a drought, you'll want to go to your longer recovery time. And on top of that, what you assumed is the optimal recovery might not even be enough. So for this year, and I think you also had a hard late summer dry, we received 2 mils of rain in March, 5 mils last March. And, it used to be summer safe down here in South Otago, but it's not anymore, apparently. So, for March, we had originally planned 25 to 35 days, we felt would have been good because previously we were getting full recovery in 30 days. But with last year's dry, from now on, we're going to have to change that range to be much larger just because, it appears the climate's changing. So this becomes a real adaptable tool that will always work so long as you adjust it as you need to according to the weather. And that's what makes it different. And I just want to kind of stress the importance of getting your nutrients cycling with your animal density. I believe this is how those, what I call the unlimited grasslands of the past, this is how they achieved those really high levels of production. The nutrients were cycling really rapidly because megafauna have a huge ability to trample stuff and get carbon cycling back through the whole system. And really important in the productivity bit. And something about fertilizer, some of my clients have reduced fertilizer, which I think is great, but I don't recommend it actually, because one thing I've learned is that there's so much to learn around this, soil health, livestock health, and all of this. It's impossible for us to know it all. So if we mimic nature, I think we'll always be safe. And nature applied her fertilizer in the spring and the autumn. And I tell the story about, a settler to the US back in the 1800s recorded in his diary that it took 14 days for one flock of passenger pigeons to fly overhead as they were migrating. So you can imagine the the inputs that were going on. They said when those flocks roosted in trees on their migration, the guano underneath the trees was a foot deep. So I think, I don't recommend fertilizers, but I do recommend if you're going to reduce them to, or even apply different fertilizers, it makes sense to do half of a paddock and monitor it. So if you're going to apply a new fertilizer or switch fertilizers, do a trial on a half of a paddock somewhere, plate the difference and see if the new fertilizer pays for itself or not. And the same with reducing fertilizer, because there's nothing sustainable about a farm that goes out of business. So this, some of these photos from my farm in New York are old and grainy because, cell phones didn't take good pictures in 2014. But this is the density we were achieving on our farm. All we did was split the day paddock in half, sometimes 3 times, and the night paddock we'd split in half to double our density. And here's kind of a close-up of the residual in the front and the grass that they were going into in the back. So this is midsummer. There's, some weeds have kind of gotten away, but actually one of those is milkweed, which is the only food that monarch butterfly caterpillars eat. So we didn't worry about it. And on the whole, the pasture is effective. And it's green almost all the way to the bottom. Pumping liquid carbon for us. So it's not supposed to look tidy. And this is the hardest bit for Kiwis to wrap their heads around, is that tidy look. Because if you go into, a natural bush here in New Zealand, there's nothing tidy about it. And that's what's wonderful about it. And so this information, this research done in the US kind of drives home why it's important to leave those higher residuals and get them trampled, because even those trampled grasses are actually photosynthesizing. But remember, we talked earlier about that liquid carbon pathway being so important to increase the carbon in the soil long term. So I used to think when the roots died back, they were adding all this litter to the soil when I was managing for my perennial ryegrass. But in the 15 years we managed for perennial ryegrass, our soil organic matter never went up. And in New Zealand, the soil organic matter isn't going up either. And that's probably why the government is suggesting other ways for farmers to be regenerative. But I believe you can lift that by increasing the amount of liquid carbon you're pumping down by not killing the roots. So if you leave 50% of the plant intact as a residual, even if you trample most of that down, you're not going to kill the roots. Whereas if you utilize 60% of that pasture, you kill half of the roots. And of course, if you utilize 70%, which you might see and pretty often, yeah, 3/4 of the roots are dying back. So this is what the trampling of a deferred pasture looked like on our farm. And it's mostly green that we're trampling down. We didn't defer it long enough to turn brown, although some bits might have in the seed heads. And this kind of pasture trampled down has just the right carbon to nitrogen ratio of a good compost. And it needs to be trampled down to the soil surface. And I mentioned earlier about the hard hooves on the cows and the sheep. This is why they've got those hard hooves, because if these plants aren't flush with the soil and touching the soil, the worms and grubs can't pull it down to feed everything else under the soil, and it'll just oxidize into the air. For instance, if you top it, it'll sit, 20 centimeters, 10 or 20 centimeters off the ground and oxidize into the air instead of feeding the soil. So this paddock in the foreground, I know I didn't top it because there's actually no access for tractors onto this paddock. And so this is the kind of quality we could achieve in the summer with, not really high densities, nothing crazy. You can see in the background, my little 100-cow herd mobbed up into their section of pasture. This pasture is up at Hamish Galloway's in Hawke's Bay. Grass getting a little away from him, but he's not too worried because he's moving the cattle frequently enough so that they're getting a high level of nutrition. And he had a Dairy NZ field day with a lot of skeptical farmers. And I asked one of the farmers there, I go, what do you think of, Hamish's residual here, which I think is quite good because he's, bitten or trampled at least 85% of the plants. Once you push them to eat 100% of these plants, you're going to lose animal performance because they'll be forced to eat near something that smells like their own dung. So that's why, I think that 15% left uneaten is fine. So when I asked one of these farmers what he thought, he's like, I'd be mortified if my pasture looked like this. So I asked him, what kind of milk solids he was making. And he said, oh, so this is November. He said 1.7. And I was like, oh, well, Hamish is making 2.3. And it just didn't seem to make any difference to him because he just didn't like the untidy look. Another photo of Hamish's residuals. This is springtime. I think this is really, really good. There's bits left uneaten, which is telling us that the cows have gotten a high level of quality and weren't made to eat offensive bits. And there was a high level of trampling too. A close-up of some good trampling there. And this is the quality that he sent me this photo of his pastures in March. And I know they all look like this because I've been to his farm, the kind of quality he's achieving by allowing the plants to recover to that optimal recovery and using that animal density. He did push the density October and November to 5 shifts a day, but after Christmas, he was away on holiday for 3 weeks, and then the cows just got a new break after each milking. So again, the important time is in the spring. Any plant they don't eat in the spring, they're not going to eat for the rest of the season. And just to talk a little more about why tidy is not ideal. So this was our pastures in New York, what they would look like by the end of the summer. And you've seen all these, pretty vegetative looking pastures. And one thing I want to point out is when a farmer looks at a paddock, you'll see every seed head in the whole paddock at the same time because you're looking across it. But if you look down from a drone, that paddock could look very green. So we've left, possibly 15% of this grass is allowed to go to seed, which, by the way, is going to provide our seed bank for the future, for forever. But I took this photo of the bottom of what the cows were eating. And again, this is the end of the summer. So we've got, the perennial ryegrass is coming back, lots of, white clover, and the cows are getting plenty of quality, and they'll eventually trample the rest of all that pasture by spring. This is an example of what I think a good regenerative pasture looks like in springtime. This is Dingleburn Station. They've been using holistic management for many years. So during the previous grazing season, the animals weren't asked to, eat everything, because instead of eating the tall bits, they would have decked the best plants and removed them. So yeah, this is kind of what I think is that 10-15% bit that slipped by. Those will be rapidly trampled this season. And it's mimicking what nature did. So Mother Nature, to achieve a high level of production, she stacked her enterprises, had different, different classes of wildlife all grazing together, and traveling in big mobs and doing a lot of trampling to get more nutrient cycling to support more animals total.
Hey, Siobhan, I'm just aware of the time, and if we can wrap it up and then let's have a little bit of discussion.
Yeah, we can go to Q&A. So yeah, I'll just whip through these and we'll do that. So this is Sean Brazahan's farm. I just want to show you an example of this mimicking nature where he's combined the sheep and cattle together. And by doing this, he was able to have more pastures resting longer and achieving that fast growth of grass. And this is just one more farm, Tinwald Station. They combined 1,800 ewes plus their lambs, and they followed them with this mob of cattle, 200 or 300 head of cattle. And I'll just show you quickly what, targeting the 2-leaf stage because there's lambs in the mob. And this is what his plan looked like. This is what the pasture under irrigation looked like that the sheep were going into. And this is the residual left by the sheep. And I don't know if you can see that they've licked the tips of the plants, the very tips of the grasses and the tips of the clover. And then cattle come behind and tidy up the rest. And this is what the kind of quality he ended up with by February. So I can escape out of this now and we can go to Q&A. Any questions?
Awesome. Thanks a lot for that, Siobhan. Real interesting. I don't think I'd ever have heard a presentation from you before, but John King had often mentioned your work. So yeah, no, really, thanks a lot for that. Lots of interesting stuff. I've got a couple. Down. Any questions from the group? Well,
Sorry, can you hear me okay, Siobhan?
You might have to talk loud.
Just the observation on the thistles up in Taumanui. I didn't quite catch how they managed those, or managed to basically, I think you said, remove the thistles through better grazing management.
Yeah, so I don't believe he had topped those paddocks. I think, I'm not sure what he did early in the, I know what he did early in the spring. he went into slightly higher covers in the spring. So he must have either, taken the sheep out earlier to let it recover early on after lambing. And then he managed it similarly to the rest of the farm. But once summer came, he extended the recoveries to, try to achieve that 3-leaf stage of the perennial ryegrass, and just let those grasses canopy over the thistles better. But I think one thing that really helped was having that slightly higher cover in the spring. So how that works in a practical way, if you've got 1 or 2 really thistly paddocks, you might want to shut them up. You might want to collect some of your mobs of ewes and lambs and put them kind of at a higher stock density on other paddocks, and let those thistly ones recover a bit, so that there's something there to compete with the thistles at that time, that the thistles are going from a flat rosette to shooting up in the air, because that's the time that they normally have no competition, because ewes and lambs are eating everything around them to eliminate their competition. And then also then in the summer, by having slightly longer recoveries in the summer, he got more competition there as well. But he did not top. Is that Bryce I see in the back? Hey mate, how's it going on your farm?
Really good season.
Yeah, I can't hear too well.
He said it's going well. I had a good season, good rain.
Thank God. It's long overdue, eh?
Yeah.
What sort of densities are you talking for to sort of get the desired trampling in the spring and stuff?
So I'm not a big fan of the ultra high density, because I think it's too stressful on the animals. And also, if you're at a really high density and you're 15 minutes late on your shift, you could really do a lot of damage. So I'm not a huge fan. I don't measure, kgs per hectare of density. I think it really has to be put in the context of your lifestyle. And if you've got, kids to pick up from school, there's so many variables. But I think the low hanging fruit is combining mobs. So the more mobs you can put together and manage effectively with the water systems that you've got, the more grass you're going to grow and the more grass you'll have to work with.
I just had a question. You mentioned around, I think it was your farm in the state of New York, and you had a slide with all the positive outcomes that you'd noticed from your kind of management or changes in management. But I was just wondering, in terms of profitability, was that still just as profitable?
Yeah. So yeah, I can go a little more into detail on those numbers. So we were able to grow some more grass because our pastures weren't drying out in the summer anymore. So that became one of our profit centers. The other profit center was healthier animals, and we had extra heifers to sell. In other words, we needed 20% fewer replacements. So that became a profit center. So any farmer could, do those maths on their own farm. But by not having to buy the $80,000 worth of grain, we were able to enter the all grass fed market and actually get a higher price for our milk. So the profitability, was much higher because we needed to buy less supplement, basically, because we did not want to increase our animal numbers for lifestyle reasons. But I think for sheep and beef farms, for my sheep and beef clients, I like to see all of them increase their stocking rate, and they have been, because there's been so much overgrazing in the past that there's been a big opportunity for them to grow grass faster on their farm in the summer. And, one thing I didn't get to was, winter rounds. So that client that was holding that, 4-leaf stage blade of a cocksfoot grass, we started out on a 90-day round for her winter round, but we discovered as she left, higher covers in the winter, the grass was recovering so much quicker that she really only needed a 75-day round in June and July. So then the following year, we shifted her optimal recovery that we were trying to achieve to 75 to 85 days. And she grew so much grass by spring that she didn't know what to do with it. So yeah, it was very powerful. And there was a study, it's actually on the slideshow we didn't get to. A study was done back in the 50s in New Zealand, and they found that farmers who were on 3 rounds in the winter grew much more grass than the farmers that were on 1 round. But we've all gone to 1 winter round because we know it's going to get us through winter. But what it does, because it's a slower round, the animals eat the pastures lower, so they take longer to recover. So it's kind of, something you could think about. So for my clients down here, I'm recommending they go to 2 winter rounds instead of 1. But, that would be the place to start. I don't know if 3 would be too many, probably would.
You had a question, you had a slide which said, I think there was no impact on winter, increased production if you ate down to 2 centimeters height or something like that. And then you had the root.
I don't know if Collier can repeat that because I can't hear it.
Oh, James was just asking about the slide where it showed in winter you could eat the plant down to really low, and it didn't.
Didn't impact production.
Oh, it didn't.
It
Didn't. Yeah. Production. But then he's asking how does that line up with the graph that showed the the grazing residual and then root length. If you're grazing it all down, then how the impact on the root length? Yeah. So in that trial, which was done in New Zealand, it was done on perennial ryegrass. So perennial ryegrass and your sod forming grasses respond well to that decking in the winter because they can freshen up from the bottom nice and green. So they define decking as 2 centimeters. I think that's a little too low if you've got bunch forming grasses, and it's the bunch forming grasses that we want to see because they'll perform year round. So, it kind of depends where you're coming from, but I think you don't need to be afraid of taking pastures low in the winter, but I don't like to see bare ground and things, if it looks brown, I think it's too low. If it's still green, you're good to go. So pretty much if you're decking it like in winter, it's not going to impact